All right, today we're jumping into the really fascinating and honestly kind of confusing story of Avelo Airlines. It's a story about a young budget airline that, on the surface, seems to be doing everything completely backwards in order to succeed. So let me ask you this. You hear an airline is cutting flights, laying off people, and walking away from a big government contract. What's your first thought? They're in deep trouble, right? They've got to be on the ropes. Well, when it comes to Avelo, the real answer is a whole lot more complicated. So let's break down what's actually going on here. Because in early 2026, Avelo made a whole series of announcements that, to anyone watching, really looked like a company in full retreat. And we're not talking about small tweaks here. The scale of this shakeup is pretty huge. The airline is ending its very controversial deal to fly deportation charters for ICE. They're cutting a bunch of their regular commercial routes. They're shutting down 3 entire crew bases, laying people off, and get this, they're even sending back 6 of their planes. I mean, that is a massive pullback for such a young airline. Yeah, let's just focus on that for a second. 6 Boeing 737s. For a budget carrier that only got started back in 2021, shrinking your fleet that drastically is a really, really big deal. It's the kind of move that gets everyone in the industry talking. Now, to really get this story, you have to understand the centerpiece of all these cuts, that government contract. Because this wasn't just some side gig flying charters. It was a deal that put Avelo right in the middle of a political firestorm. These ICE charter flights were exactly what they sound like. Avelo was operating flights for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and yeah, a lot of those were for deportations. As you can probably guess, this led to protests and a ton of backlash, putting the airline under a very different, much harsher spotlight than it ever wanted. So why did they stop? Well, publicly, the company spun it as a simple business decision. The CEO, Andrew Levy, basically said that the whole program was just too much of a headache. It was operationally complex, the money wasn't consistent enough, and at the end of the day, it just wasn't worth the cost. But you can also see signs of pressure from the inside. The flight attendants union sounded pretty relieved, pointing out that their members were operating flights they didn't originally sign up for. You know, that's a clear signal that morale was taking a hit and that a lot of people felt the company had lost its way. So here's where we are. We've got an airline ditching a controversial contract, shrinking its fleet, and cutting jobs. I mean, it seems like an open and shut case of a business that's in serious trouble. But just when you think you have it figured out, the story takes a massive turn. Right as this picture of Avelo in crisis was starting to solidify, the CEO dropped an absolute bombshell, and he did it in the very same memo that announced all those cuts. He told his employees that the airline's financial position has never been stronger. Wait, what? How is that even possible? How can you be stronger than ever while you're literally shrinking your entire operation right before our eyes? The answer, as it so often is money. It turns out, Avelo had just quietly raised a substantial amount of new capital. And that one fact, that one detail, reframes everything. Suddenly, these don't look like the desperate cuts of a failing company. They look like the calculated moves of a freshly funded airline that's cleaning house to get ready for a brand new strategy. So what does this new, leaner, more focused Avelo actually look like? Well, it's all about consolidation. It's about doubling down on what actually works and cutting out what doesn't. You can see the whole strategy right here on the map. Avelo is pulling out of bases in places like Arizona and North Carolina, and instead, they're pouring all those resources into a handful of what they see as really promising hubs, mostly on the East Coast and a new one in Texas. They're going from a kind of scattered, throw-it-at-the-wall network to something much more concentrated and, they hope, a lot more profitable. You could really boil their new game plan down to 3 simple steps. First, get rid of the messy, complicated charter business. Step 2, shrink the fleet down to a more manageable, more efficient size. And step 3, take all that cash you've saved, plus the new investment money, and focus it like a laser on the bases that show the most promise for the future. It's a classic shrink-to-grow strategy. And all of this brings us to the big, central question at the heart of this story. Is this a brilliant reset for long-term strength, or is it just a high-stakes gamble to stay alive in the short term? I mean, the change in strategy is just so stark. Avelo is shifting from this phase of rapid, almost chaotic expansion, trying to do commercial and government work at the same time, to a much more focused, purely commercial, and way leaner operation. It's a total reinvention of their business model. So what's the final verdict here? Is getting smaller, simpler, and having more cash in the bank the secret recipe for making it in the ridiculously tough budget airline market? Or is Avelo just buying itself a little more time before the clock runs out? It's turned into this fascinating case study in airline strategy, and you can bet that the rest of the industry is watching very, very closely to see how this gamble pays off.